Welcome Delian to the show. How you doing, Delian?
Bulgarian mafioso, just carrying a bat, ready to break kneecaps at all times.
I was gonna bring that up to you. I thought it was a rumor, but uh, how's it going? I think I want to kick it off. I mean, we'll get to the space stuff. Obviously, the Delta V with Delian must go on. But what's the reaction to AGI arriving? April 16th being AGI day. Are you feeling the acceleration? Are you feeling the AGI? Do you still have a job, or can AGI break kneecaps?
I do think that there are, sort of junior research jobs that, probably got a lot harder to, sort of justify both in like the land of like, sort of venture all the way to like, sort of grad school labs.
Yeah.
The stuff is getting like really good. Like I'm not somebody that has been investing in a ton of, sort of AI slop, but I think it's, sort of crazy to not figure out how to like integrate this stuff into your workflow. And like I very regularly now, like will read a paper and then immediately go to ChatGPT and use it as like a little bit of like a quiz to make sure like I understood
Yeah.
it, or like I've been getting into a little bit of like trying to take some like quantum physics classes and like the sort of nights and weekends, and same thing. I like basically have ChatGPT like be my tutor,
Yeah.
like structure which courses and videos I should watch, like pull like even though I can like go pull the homework myself, I'm like go find the homework on like the MIT website and like
Yep.
pull it for me, and then I'm just gonna like submit the homework to you and you go check it against like the
Yeah.
solution set. That way, like it's like all these things that I just don't have to do, and it's sophisticated enough to actually like be able to read like a PDF of like paper that I put in, and it goes and grades it. That's like literally what like the junior grad students are for at colleges, or like to go grade the the P sets.
So you're out of a job once the humanoid robotics drops, and then they can break the kneecaps, and then you don't have anything to
That's
do.
all I have value for at Founders Fund is just like,
Yeah.
I just like threaten people with violence in order
Yep.
to, get money in.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Whatever it takes.
Anyway, in your world outside of AI, what is the top story in defense space? For the normies, I think Blue Origin was top of mind this week. We can talk about that, but on a serious level, like what is actually important for people to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different stories that have, come out over the past couple of weeks that are all kind of, related to some of the Trump tariff stuff, where basically what he's done is effectively like implemented the trade war that would have happened if a hot war with Taiwan had started, to start to basically preview. In some ways, it's almost like a military exercise in that it's basically like, let's go preview and see, sort of what China, would do if a hot war, kicked off. And so they obviously have like immediately restricted a bunch of rare earth minerals. I think the area that, people should be paying more attention to is basically all things, sort of semiconductor, landscape. The articles that came out yesterday talking about Nvidia basically getting sort of slapped on the wrist because they were exporting, I forget what the number was, but like $20 billion per year of chips to like Singapore. Singapore is obviously not buying $20 billion worth of chips. They were just immediately going and reselling those to China, and so Jensen Huang is going to get a bit of a sort of slap on the wrist. But the whole Taiwan story is all around the sort of semiconductor industry, and there was some news that came out about 2 weeks ago where the Chinese are working on a synchrotron as a energy source for lithography and semiconductors. So there's a bunch of different sort of components of the sort of stack of sort of semis, but to really keep it sort of brain dead simple, you basically have like the chip designers of the world. Think of those as like sort of the sort of Apples of the world with their like A1 chips as an example. You have the sort of tools providers that make the tools that are necessary for sort of semiconductor processes. By far the most famous there is sort of ASML and lithography, and then you have the foundries. Think of those as like the factories that sort of make the sort of chips, and they're obviously TSMC is sort of best in class. The tools and the like sort of foundry are where there's been by far the most aggregation, let's say, sort of in the market, right? That's where it's basically a monopsony. We're obviously, sort of trying to break the, sort of TSMC monopsony, and obviously we're spending on CHIPS Act, et cetera, trying to get this stuff reshored to the United States and get foundry set up here. There hasn't been a whole lot of effort, sort of domestically in the United States to really do anything around lithography. We've just kind of accepted that the Dutch, right, ASML, I think is a Dutch company,
The Dutch.
are gonna, have that monopoly on lithography. And then people are starting to think a little differently now that it looks like that the Chinese maybe have an alternative effort. There's sort of one liner like, sort of what is lithography? It's basically like you shine light at a mask. Some light passes through that mask, and then it, basically, inscribe something on a wafer, and that wafer, it's basically what you're inscribing is the chip. The way that like Dutch people do it is they basically like zap tin droplets really fast and really precisely. And it turns out when you zap tin droplets, they release a very particular wavelength pretty coherently, and you can use that as the like what's known as like the energy source in lithography. People have theorized for a while on like, hey, are there other potential energy sources? In particular, all the like linear accelerator synchrotron stuff that for the longest time was purely like physics science research. This is like think like CERN, think about like Spark down at Stanford, right? All this stuff was just like, let's run particles really fast, let's try and discover the Higgs boson and stuff like that. That's all that it was used for. And then at some point people were like, man, like this stuff is actually like getting pretty good. Maybe like we could actually like use this commercially, because like the reason we zap the tin droplets is to get like XYZ very short wavelength out of them. But like maybe we can just attune these linear accelerators to basically just be like really, 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 really fancy lasers and get energy sources out of them. And so people have like theorized about that. And then it kind of looks like the Chinese have claimed that they've started to demonstrate that. And so now there's a bit of a panic in the US where it's like, oh shit, like they could take over Taiwan. And then in theory, we could try to ban, ASML, from, selling to China. But maybe that doesn't fucking matter, because they've figured out their own way of basically doing, sort of lithography. And so now the United States has got to think about, well, like, do we want to start to spin up our own internal effort that is, using linear accelerators or synchrotrons and try to decouple from ASML and decouple from Taiwan at the same time? So we have Arizona doing, the foundries, but then, maybe we co-opt the, sort of Stanford linear accelerator and, sort of turn that into a lithography shop and build a foundry around that too. So, anyways, that's the area that I feel like people don't, sort of think about enough lately.
Yeah.
Is there any, and I don't have context here, I don't know if you do, but is there any effort to get ASML to start manufacturing here in the United States, or is it just completely out of the question, right? Because we've seen the efforts of TSMC, NVIDIA came out and is basically doing, I read it as marketing. They came out a couple of days ago and said, NVIDIA to manufacture American-made AI supercomputers in the US for the first time, pulling out the supercomputer word. But basically saying they want to make hundreds of billions of dollars of their new Blackwell chips here in the US, which is awesome, but I just don't, it's hard to read in how much of that is sort of marketing versus like actually super real. But I'm curious if you've heard of anything on the actual ASML side in terms of US operations.
I feel like we just don't have leverage in that, sort of relationship. Like it's not obvious, like what lever to pull, like at least in like the whole, like, sort of Taiwan, et cetera thing. It's like, hey, this is a geopolitical enemy. Like, all the Western allies agree generally, sort of with that. If you start to sell to them, we're going to like, sanction the shit out of you. NVIDIA is like a US company. There's like, we can slap them with US fines. With ASML, it's like, okay, this is like a, sort of European company. And like, if we start to try to like sanction or slap fines on them, they'll be like, okay, great. The very limited number of machines we were selling to the US, we're going to stop selling them. We're going to keep selling to Taiwan because they're obviously, by far our biggest customer. And so why does like the America have that much influence in this like Dutch to Taiwanese basically relationship versus at least with like, NVIDIA and Crew, that's like a US to Taiwan, relationship. And we can, sort of influence that. And so, I haven't, I'm not even sure if I were in Trump's shoes, like what angle I would even try to take to like, do that. And then also these ASML machines are like, so complicated to manufacture. I mean, it's like it's extremely complicated to operate them, right? Like that's what sort of Taiwan has basically sort of figured out how to do. Manufacturing them is like even more complicated, and so somehow figuring out how to like pull that out of the Netherlands. Man, that seems like a really Herculean effort. That's where it's like, I think actually you're sort of better off starting with a blank slate on a totally different technological approach and just like domesticating that rather than trying to like, try to force them to move manufacturing operations to the US.
How do you think about the role of the government in actually winning some of these really key industries? Like we did this whole dive yesterday on China's investment in the domestic semiconductor industry, and they've poured tons of resources into that. But I'm always reminded of there's that segment in 0 to 1 about Solyndra, how the government tried to kind of pick a winner. They gave them this, I think it's a $535 million loan guarantee, and any physicist could have told you just the basic math on the cylindrical was not going to win. Meanwhile, China, it's not that they were like, let's let the free market win. They had the Golden Sun program. They subsidized subsidized photovoltaics super aggressively, but were they just smarter and they funded the right thing, or do they do something differently? Like it feels like I want the linear accelerator, if that's the right path in the tech tree, to happen, and I want to win, but also I don't necessarily want us to just like get scared and mimetically invest in exactly what the Chinese are building. And there's like this dance of like, low taxes versus like, okay, sometimes the government does need to step into these things. Like, how are you thinking about the role of the government in like driving R&D right now?
Yeah, if there's a way to like, sort of distinguish between the two potential strategies governments can take, one is like, sort of subsidize inputs or, match investment efforts or something, broadly in an entire market, but don't take a particular stance on like what technology tree it needs to be a part of, just like subsidize this portion of the market. And then the other half is like subsidize a very particular path in the technology tree where there is no market whatsoever. And so if you did like market level subsidies, I think the right answer is like, probably a balance, right? Where, on all things, let's say like, sort of rare earth, sort of minerals, there it feels like there's sort of market level things that one could do, just like slash some amount of regulations, encourage, guarantee some level of sort of purchasing power from the U.S. government on like certain rare earth minerals. That way you say, hey, however you refine lithium, whether it's pulling it from the slag from the Great Salt Lake or sort of mining in Eastern California, great, however you do it.
Like a reserve is what you're talking about, right? Like building up a reserve.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're going to build up,
but it has to be American made.
But we're only going to buy it from domestic suppliers, and we're going to buy it at like this like fixed rate, right?
Yep.
In relation to space stuff, this is kind of what they've done with like the lunar payload services program, right? NASA's just said, I don't care how you build your lunar lander, but we are just going to guarantee that we're going to buy X amount of basically like lunar payload services, and it's going to be at XYZ price, and up to you how to go to do it. And so I'm definitely like a big fan of those approaches. I do think there are the occasional warranted, hey, here's a huge next step in the tech tree. It's just totally uneconomically viable for anybody to step into that tech tree without knowing that there's going to be government support, sort of basically from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, like, nuclear weapons were that. There was never going to be like a private company that was going to go invest into, figuring out, sort of the fission or fusion bombs without knowing that there was basically going to be government support.
Yeah.
I do think that like linear accelerator is sort of one of those. Now, there's a big question of like, is it Cylindra? Is it, fearfully copying the Chinese mimeticism? But it's like, I'm not sure if there's any other option where, I'm not sure if there is any other credible, approach to domesticating lithography. Like, I don't think that like trying to just copy the ASML tech tree makes any sense.
Yep.
I'm not sure that anybody else has come up with an energy source that like, sort of is an option. So there probably needs to be like some, sort of bet. So if we were to assign XYZ budget to like domesticating foundries, I mean, probably 10% of that equivalent budget should be assigned to trying to domesticate lithography.
Yeah.
And there's really only one bet on that tech tree basically, sort of to make. And so, I mean, it's kind of a lame answer, but I think the answer is like, there needs to be a little bit of a blended approach to like, national reserves guaranteeing demand in, refined lithium domestically in the United States. There's also some questions on like, look, like, with like, let's say magnets, we do a lot of like, the rare earth mineral production of those, magnet precursors, but the actual like, sort of final synthesis and refinement, that all happens in China. But a part of why it happens in China is like the current processes are like crazy destructive for the environment. And so it's like actually a question of like, I mean, maybe we do want to domesticate it, but like where, how do we want to like try to come up with a different process, but it's like better for the environment, but like 10x more expensive. Like, there are questions like that where it's like, anyway, we were kind of looking into like the magnet supply chain recently, and as we were debating an internal investment, it's like you look at that step in the supply chain, and I'm like, man, it's like not particularly technologically difficult. It's like really easy for us to replicate, but it literally is just like it releases poison into the environment.
Taking it back to space, it seems like the helicopter on Mars, the massive James Webb telescope, like these are things that are not economically viable, but I could totally see them paying off and being like, oh, that was a great investment. Even just like inspiring the next generation, but also like probably commercializing some technology down the road. On the flip side, we saw Blue Origin with the space tourism thing. It's like barely space, just past the Kármán line. But how do you think that plays into the overall like space economy? Do you like that strategy of growing that business? Is that a business that could stand on its own, or is it just kind of like a fun side project for Bezos. I don't know what you know about that that whole like industry as it's growing, because we've seen it kind of play out before with Virgin Galactic, and I'd love to know what you think about space tourism generally.
Yeah, I mean, I want to also touch on like the sort of earlier point that you had around like the helicopter on Mars, James Webb Telescope, et cetera. I'm not sure if you know, but the White House actually recently released its proposed NASA budget after future nominated administrator sort of Jared Isaacman after his confirmation hearing, and in it they significantly slashed all sort of science sort of missions at NASA, and so that includes future telescopes that we have in the works. That includes some of those helicopter on Mars missions, and so the White House is at least taking a stance on that is not something that we see as being sort of valuable. Those are definitely sort of things that clearly don't have any sort of economic sort of feedback loops, like more deeply understanding the universe. I don't know if you recently saw, we like found an exoplanet where it looks like there are organic compounds that on Earth are only made by marine algae, and the planet is very large and in the Goldilocks zone of a red dwarf star that would be at a temperature zone where sort of liquid water would be possible. And so it's like what is the sort of value of that? Hard to sort of prescribe economically. And the White House has at least thought, hey, we don't see the geopolitical sort of significance in this. Doesn't get boots on the moon, and it doesn't return sort of to an economic use case. So that's at least the White House's stance, which is also, for what it's worth, it was different than what Administrator Isaacman said in his confirmation hearing. So, it's interesting to see that obviously there's maybe some disconnect between the administrator and the White House. On all things space tourism, I don't think it's sort of an economic sort of use case that is going to be what really sort of drives us to the frontier. Whenever I've thought about Varda, I always go back to this 15th sort of century analogy, which sometimes people think is a bit of a stretch. I think it's actually pretty reasonable. But if you look at the early 1400s and the Portuguese and the Chinese Empire, they both were in the early days of investing into basically their naval capabilities, and they took sort of radically different approaches. The Chinese basically took the approach of build these very large and ornate ships and go and sail along the African coast, sort of capture elephants, bring back some gems, and bring them back to the Chinese emperor as basically displays of power, right? And so, the Chinese emperor would now have a pet elephant for the first time. They would have these gems. They would have these like African trinkets. The Portuguese took a very different approach. The Portuguese built very small naval merchant flotillas. They would basically, dock along the African coast. They wouldn't tour the entire coast like the Chinese did. They would just stay there, make a trading outpost, basically find sort of economic means and reasons for that naval flotilla to be around. And then only once that initial merchant outpost was established would they move basically 50 miles west down the coast until they eventually covered the entire coast. So fast forward to the late, sort of 1400s, where did these naval empires basically end up? The Chinese emperor ended up deciding that this was basically a waste of resources. He didn't see any economic value for his empire for having elephants around, and so ultimately basically shut down the entire naval, sort of power for China for the following, I think, almost 300 years. The Portuguese, as you could probably guess, became the most powerful naval power, in the entire world, and led to significant, growth of their empire. And so I think about, sort of space, sort of pretty similar to the, sort of naval frontier in the, sort of 1400s and 1500s. I think you want to find these, sort of clear economic use cases that, involve trade and resources versus the like, sort of Katy Perry going above the Kármán line is probably kind of like the elephant for the emperor, where, Bezos gets to, sort of pop some champagne. And, I'm sure his wife is super happy that, Katy Perry feels indebted to, sort of them as a couple. But like, I don't know that like generates a ton of economic value. And so,
so the economic incentive around space is obvious. Let's maybe talk about the national security incentive, specifically China in 2030. They've come out and said very clearly, we want to put, our astronauts on the moon. I don't know if it's by 2030, but in the early 2030s. So maybe, how much can you speak to?
Yeah, do boots on the ground actually matter, or would it be viable for them just to send up so many landing zones that they start building? Like, we've heard about this, like when you land, you kick up a bunch of dust, and so you're kind of de facto claiming an area, and there's only so much ice, water there. So, like, if they could just send a bunch of like rovers, they could effectively start claiming, and they may not even ever need to send humans to really claim the resources. What do you think?
Yeah, let me give you the sort of China bear versus China sort of bull case on this.
Sure.
The China bear case is this is China repeating the same mistakes from the 1400s. So they're going there. They haven't really figured out, sort of economic use cases. They don't even even really figured out economic use cases in LEO, right? They have nothing equivalent to like Starlink generating billions of dollars, of commercial, sort of revenues that you can use as infrastructure to build off of, right? And so they're the, sort of Chinese with, yes, they're building big fancy ships. Yes, they're landing rovers on the backside of the moon, but they're not connecting this into capitalism whatsoever. And so this will all, sort of fade away versus the United States, the Portuguese. While we maybe haven't more recently succeeded as well as they have on the moon, we've got Starlink, we've got Starship going up, we have all these things that are built off of commercial infrastructure. And so while we may not have as big of a ship soon, if you fast forward over the course of the next 30 years, the Chinese will shut down their program and will be the most powerful naval empire, e.g. space empire in the entire universe. Trying to, sort of bull case. Nobody's landed, sort of on the, sort of backside of the moon ever and returned samples. Perhaps they're finding, helium-3 deposits. They're finding lunar ice deposits. They're taking a much more concerted approach to trying to get, sort of human boots on the moon and forcing it from top down. And if they get those first handful of boots, like you said, they can, sort of claim, particular land areas. And there's only a handful of craters on the moon today that are clearly known to have lunar ice. If they claim those first handful, if they start mining that ice, they can turn it into propellant. They can turn it into economic value where they can send that back into low Earth orbit to some of their satellites they have set up there. They're setting up, sort of Starlink, sort of competitors. And so there's definitely a world where, they establish the first, sort of permanent lunar presence while we get distracted by this dual path between moon and Mars. That permanent, sort of lunar presence turns into a mining operation. And so they do connect it back to economic value, even though it has a lot of like, strong, from top down state power, getting it established. It eventually transitions to something, sort of fully economic. And so I think there's a way to, sort of take both those angles. I think you should never underestimate, sort of your, enemies. And so I tend to take the China bull case and assume that is the default. And I think we're a little, sort of, lost in the rudder right now. I think, it'll be interesting to see how, Administrator Isaacman, sort of comes in and starts to put together what our plans are for, getting boots on the moon, over the course of the next 4 years.
Do you have any insight into like the timeline of actually generating propellant on the moon? I've heard like, oh, there's water, and at a certain point you can draw out the chemical process for turning like carbon and hydrogen into some fuel, but like that's hard to desalination is hard in America, in California. I can imagine that actually taking the resources on the moon and turning to propellant is like a massive industrial process that looks more like a Tesla gigafactory than like a little science experiment. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Like, is this something where we could actually build a box that starts doing this, get it up there in the next decade? Or are we talking about like 20, 30, 40, 50 years?
I think this is where like exponential equations always, sort of catch up on you in a way that's, sort of unexpected. If you look at the total mass to orbit, basically over the past decade, it's basically following a perfect exponential equation.
Yeah.
And so I think this stuff is, sort of way sooner than people expect. Like I actually think with a concerted, concentrated effort, I think we can get boots on the moon again before, Trump is out of office.
Wow.
And it's not like, sort of betting on a bunch of, sort of net new, sort of radical programs. It's, Starship maturing at the, sort of rate that it is, maybe a little bit more aggressive, sort of the current, Artemis vehicles, Orion, et cetera. And some of the current lunar lander companies starting to develop, sort of larger landers. I think that's all, I'm not saying that's going to happen like in the next year or two. It would be like late in the Trump, sort of presidency, but I think it's possible. On the like conversion to fuel, not that complicated a process. There's like 5 or 6 groups that are sort of already, sort of working on it. I'd say the desalination thing, that's, sort of more of a economic challenge than it is like a technical, challenge to like basically, justify the amount of water that you need. The benefit of water on the moon is like on a per kilogram basis. It's so incredibly valuable because it's just so much easier to shoot water from the moon into low Earth orbit than it is to bring water, from Earth's surface up into low Earth orbit. And even to start, you don't need anything more complicated than water. Like you can use water as, it's not a very good propellant, but you can basically just spray water and it is a rocket, propellant. Now there's, better things you can do. You can turn it into, atomic hydrogen and stuff like that, and hydrogen gas, or liquid hydrogen. But, you can start with very, sort of basic things. And so, I think it's like a end of decade problem, totally solvable. Now depends on, taking a really concerted focus effort. And again, maybe a part of it is you do have to sacrifice the Mars helicopter. You have to sacrifice, some of these, sort of telescopes, et cetera, to get the country really, really focused on getting lunar infrastructure set up as quickly as possible.
What's the probability that you or I go to the moon in the next 20 years?
Specifically you or I?
Yes. What's your P moon?
I'd say our P moon is like, 35% is my
I
P
love
moon.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been talking to my son about that. We look up at the moon, and I'm like, "Do you want to go with me?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like,
course.
"I think it's possible. I think
If
it's
you extend that
possible."
to 40 years, I would put like P moon at like 98%.
Awesome.
Um,
So wait, there's this conspiracy theory that the Blue Origin launch didn't happen, that they didn't go to space, that it's impossible to go to space using only family-friendly language. What would you say about the people that don't believe they went to space?
Well, there's certain conspiracy theories that always have some truth or merit to them. JFK probably was killed by the CIA. Um, NASA may have had a soundstage for the sort of lunar landing as a backup, and Katy Perry probably is not an astronaut. You could probably just fly a fighter jet up and then down, and you probably roughly get the same experience that she did. Very different to be going a little up, a little down versus 15,000 miles an hour. So I'd say God bless his conspiracy theorists. They're always helping us find the kernels of truth in the stories that they weave.
Yeah, that's legitimate.
Going back to space and geopolitics, China has their National Space Day on April 24th, so next week. Is that something significant in the space community that people are like really paying attention to? Like they feel like there's going to be like real signal or exciting results, or is it just kind of, do people kind of write it off, or not write it off, but just kind of look at it as this sort of like kind of like a demo day, kind of marketing keynote style event where it's not a lot of signal?
They're delivering. Like, if you look at, sort of China's, sort of plans from 2018 and sort of where they are today, they're not totally off track on, sort of what they promised they'd be able to do, right? They've established their own, low Earth orbit Chinese space station. They're regularly flying astronauts up and down to it with cargo. They're attracting international partners to that space station. They've clearly gotten a coalition of folks willing to sign on to their, sort of lunar, station or lunar base plans. And so I do think it's something that, people pay a lot of attention to. They tend to, sort of, re-update or re-reveal basically what their next, sort of 5, 10, 15-year goals are. And it's something that everybody from like, sort of NASA to Space Force definitely pays a lot of attention to. They're not always fully transparent about obviously, sort of what they're up to. So there's no guarantees that there'll be anything new. But I would expect that there will be, given all the tensions that have risen over the past year between the United States and China. And so I would
Yeah, and
guarantee
how do some of these partnerships happen, right? So one of the things that they're going to be reporting on next week is related to a partnership they have with France on like a joint satellite program. Is that is that like due to NASA's shortcomings? Like, is that a missed opportunity for us to not be partnering with France on something like that? Or like how do these sort of like, how do the are the geopolitics of space almost like disconnected in some way between with Earth?
Oh no, very connected. That entire French thing, I'd basically, sort of pinpoint back to the nuclear submarine contract. Basically, the United States ended up moving a chunk of nuclear submarine contracts out of France over to Australia. The French were furious. Macron, sort of went on and, gave a bunch of public talks about it. And then basically like the, sort of Chinese collaboration started less than a month later. And so it was clearly like, hey, you're going to slap us on the wrist as an ally. Great. We're going to go to your geopolitical adversary. I don't think
But
obviously
those
that's like
two things are, one is like purely economic, like we're moving the place that we're making submarines. The other one is saying like we are partnering with your ally. Those two things feel like, one is like a business
adversary.
decision. The other one is like very clearly like, picking a side.
Totally. I mean, from France's perspective, it's like, it's billions of lost revenue for one of their, major defense primes. And, they see that as a, sort of slap on the wrist. And so, they feel like they need to, sort of slap back. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that, it's the smartest geopolitical move. I don't think like, a Western democracy should be, sort of cozying up to, an authoritarian dictatorship. But I also don't think the French are the most intelligent people in the world right now.
Well, they have the opportunity to turn it all around, because if they don't, I will be boycotting Dom Perignon. You heard it here first.
Then that will
crush
send
the
shockwaves through LVMH.
through the French economy. I will not be vacationing in Lyon or Nice or Burgundy. I will not be spending my time on the French Riviera.
I'll be in Nice late June, no matter what, no matter how dumb the French
Cancel
are.
it. Unless it comes back to
No,
America.
he's gonna turn him. He's gonna turn him.
Yeah, you got to go over there.
him.
You're our plant.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
check it on there. I'm gonna look at those Airbus facilities in Toulouse and take a look at that Chinese satellite project.
Wait, last thing. If you don't have a hard stop, how do you think about the Chinese aerospace industry specifically? They earlier in the week they canceled or paused some Boeing orders. Someone else on the show was saying, well, they'll probably just move those orders over to Airbus, something like that. But at the same time, how long is it until we're all going to be,
is it really that hard to build a jet engine? I feel like they should have copied that by now. This is kind of a bear case for them.
Well, up until a year ago, my one liner would have been, there haven't been any commercial airliner deaths in the United States for 16 years. And so the reason that it's really difficult is because just the safety bar is so high that basically nobody wants to touch anything. So they're everything's been perfect.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, sort of DCA and, sort of Toronto. Well, Toronto, I think it didn't end up leading to any deaths, but DCA obviously did.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that it's really going to change the culture. FAA aviation, regulations are just so stringent because they do have in some ways a great track record. But man, it just sets the bar so high. Will the Chinese ever really manage to get any traction? I don't know. It's definitely not in the United States ever. There's no way that the United States is ever letting a United States airline buy a Chinese, sort of jetliner.
It's the Comac C919.
Yeah. And there's no way France is going to let them, buy anybody other than Airbus. Same thing with the entire EU. So who the hell are they going to sell their Chinese airliners to, Africa or something? I don't know how big of a
Malaysia, maybe Malaysia, and teleporting.
Oh, did you
airplanes.
see that there was some, sort of revealed potential documents of 4 UFOs surrounding the Malaysian airliner and then disappearing it?
Okay. Well, we'll have to dig into that next time.
Got to get Jesse Michaels.
We could do another half an hour.
I get Jesse to come.
Yeah. We'll break it down. I really appreciate you stopping by. Thanks so much. This is great.
See you next week.
We'll talk
Cheers.
Bye.